Hi, friends, and welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Kristi Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone.
Hey, friends and podcast listeners. Welcome back to another episode of the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm so excited to be here with you. If you've been listening to the Heartful Parent Podcast for a while, you know that we don't just talk about parenting, right? As you hear me say in the intro to the podcast every week, we're not just parents, we wear a lot of hats, right? We're people, we're partners, we're professionals. And because of that, I love to talk about a lot of really broad subjects here on the pod. And this week, I'm particularly excited to be introducing someone to you who is really inspirational to me in the work that she's doing, is out there making a difference in the world, and someone who has some thoughts to share with all of us that I think will really open up some thinking, some ideas, and some awareness for all of us. So I'm going to introduce you to my friend, my colleague, my mentor, my teacher, Kristi Rible. Kristi is the founder and CEO of the Human Group, and as such is dedicated to humanizing the workplace by preparing leaders for a future of work that demands flexibility, empathy, trust, connection, and psychological safety, a full representation of our collective humanity, one that is diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Her international leadership experience spans more than 25 years of working across technology and consumer products for both public and startup ventures throughout the US, Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. She's a strong advocate for the advancement of women, and this is how I met her, she is also an instructor at Stanford on workplace equity, currently covering the topic of motherhood and work, and the challenges and opportunities for change in that space. Kristi holds an MBA in international business from Thunderbird and Arizona State University, a BA in African Studies and Classical Archaeology from Franklin and Marshall College, and executive certifications in organizational gender balance from INSEAD, diversity, equity, and inclusion from Cornell, executive coaching from UC Berkeley, and the Fair Play Method. As I mentioned, I met Kristi because I took a course through Stanford called Motherhood and Work, and Kristi is the phenomenal instructor of that course. It's a course she teaches once a year that is open to continuing ed students and is conducted remotely, so you don't need to be in California to take the class. And so I just want to throw a plug in there that if what Kristi and I talk about today sounds interesting to you, that class is really a phenomenal one. In today's conversation, Kristi and I dive into the power of language, some of the sort of modern movements and backward movements against parents and mothers and women in particular, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm super excited to dive into this conversation and to share it with you. So without further ado, Kristi Rible. Kristi, welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm so happy that we were able to make this happen.
As well. Thank you so much, Kristi, for having me. And
So
I love your name, by the way, Kristi. Great name.
Love the name. Love
right.
the name.
Perfect.
Yep. All the best
we're
people.
Connected there. That's right.
That's right. So obviously I read folks' information about you and talked a little bit about how we met. So I want to dive right in, and I'm drawing on some of the things that I learned from you in these questions. And this place I'd like to start is with language and the idea that language matters, which I think many of us have heard said, but you really opened my eyes to the idea that language matters when we're talking about parents, working parents, or parents who are in the professional workplace. And you really discourage us from using phrases like working mom or I'm just a mom, right? Which we hear said all the time.
Right.
And I'd love to have you talk a little bit about that and why in this particular context, language is so important.
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. We always hear language matters. We hear that when we're a little kid, right? On the playground, like your words have power, use them wisely. And sometimes we've learned the hard way where we have used words that don't necessarily work out for us, right? So we've always heard this. This is a common thing. And then as women and as parents, we start to put labels on who we are and what we do. And this is really a societal phenomenon, right? But it's more of a phenomenon when you think about mothers versus fathers. And what happens is there is this bifurcation that goes on, right? Are you working for pay or are you not working for pay? If you're working for pay, you're a working mother. If you're not working for pay, you're a stay-at-home mom, or you are, as many have termed themselves, oh, I'm just a mom right now, as though there's no value to that work. And we know as parents, there is so much working that takes place, whether you are sharing that with another human being in your household, or whether you are working for pay or volunteering, etc. So I think that's the starting place, and why I always talk about language matters, is that we have dissected women who become mothers into so many different categories and so many different terms. And it doesn't do us any service at all. And it doesn't really describe or place value in any of our roles. And then you look at the flip side and you look at when men become fathers, there really isn't that bifurcation happening. The term is fathers, right? We rarely say, oh, so-and-so is a working father, right?
Right.
We don't narrow that in the same way we feel we need to narrow a mother's role in life or a woman's role in life. And so it's really important to think about, because we are whole human beings. We are working, whether we are working for pay or not for pay. There is value in all of the work that we do as mothers, just as there's value in all of the work that fathers do, pay or no pay. And so it's really important, because as women, we do that ourselves sometimes, right? If there is a pause in our career for a moment in time, it is so difficult to define that. It is often difficult for women to define that, especially women that have had careers for a long period of time, right? And so um, there's much more behind the words. And so that is, I think, the lesson that I was trying to open up to everyone when we kind of start talking around the context of mothers and work, paid or
Yeah.
otherwise.
It was such an interesting conversation that we had in your class about this, because to be quite frank, it wasn't something that I had really thought about a lot before. I mean, I've certainly thought about the inequities and, as a fair play facilitator, which I know you are as well, like certainly thought about the inequities and the way that we treat, and this is obviously a broad generalization, but in the way that we treat men and women and the roles that they play, but had never broken it down to that language piece. And I have to imagine, because this was a question that came up for me, that folks who are listening to this might be asking, what should we be doing instead, right? Should we just be calling, not just, but should we be calling women with careers using sort of the same language that we do with men, right? Like, and I think the answer to that is probably yes.
Yeah.
But I'm imagining people are sort of playing with, how does that work with the language?
It's hard. It's like societal, social change is the hardest kind of change, because you are looking at shifting decades and decades of language use, and words shape our thoughts. That is the main thing, right? Words shape our thoughts. And you can look at it around even experiences that you may have within your company, right? I've had this many times, and I think that other people can relate. There are moments within your corporate culture where suddenly words surface that people use in every meeting, right? And it becomes this language and this vocabulary that you're hearing all the time within your company. And you're just wondering where this came about, right? And then whether it's right, circle back around, or other terms. Like I remember this time in my work where everything was like, don't obfuscate the this or the that, and then everyone started using this word that wasn't in my language on a day-to-day basis before. And so it's the same type of thing when we're talking about our roles, right? And we have multiple roles in our lives. We are not just one human being, right? We are whole people. So when we just narrow ourselves to working mother, or we just narrow ourselves to stay-at-home mom, we are shaping the way others think of us as well. And I know, right, that those who have children and go off into the workplace have more roles than those in their life, just as those women and mothers who step back and have taken a temporary pause, right? There is so much more to those women. And so it's just about being very intentional with how you speak about your role and what you see as your role.
Yeah. I also think, obviously, we all have many more hats or many more roles that we play. But I also see that word or that phrase, working mother, as one that many in the corporate world then interpret as someone who's not as committed to their professional role, right? We tend to make those leaps, right? Or alternatively, someone who's not as committed to their role as a mom, which is also a leap that I've heard made.
Right. This is the constant challenge that women face that many men don't face. Men are facing different types of challenges in the workplace, right? And in fact, I will go as far to say that those that want to lean more into caregiving, men who want to lean more into caregiving, they're also facing stigma and challenge because historically, right, they are the financial provider for their family, which we know is not necessarily the case as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? There is a rise in dual income households to the point that we are seeing more and more dual income families than ever before, right? And so it is not just the man's role to be that financial provider. And in household units, those units know this to be true, right? There's many ways to earn a living, and there's many people involved in that now, and yet the workplace still has an unconscious bias and a bias around fathers are the financial providers. Therefore, there is that fatherhood bonus, right? This is a real thing. This is something that has been researched for decades. Mothers face a penalty in the workplace upon having a child, and men receive a bonus in the workplace upon having a child. This isn't literal, like, oh, you've had a child, then let me pay you more, or oh, you've had a child, let me pay you less. But it is the research and the results over time that just show women are penalized 6% for every child. Because it is a unconscious bias that they are not as committed to their work any longer. Whereas men receive that bonus because that unconscious bias says they are more committed to their work because they need to earn more money for their family. And so those are things that we absolutely have to keep breaking down, because it is not necessarily true any longer. And yet our social contexts still have this belief set that is a detriment to women more so than men.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. And I love the recognition that like men are facing different issues, because I think about my husband, who is a very involved, engaged caregiver for our kids. And, feels sometimes that he's not able to bring that into the workplace or to discuss that in the workplace, because it's just not right. Men don't do that is, I think, kind of the messaging. Especially he works with a lot of younger men who don't have children yet and don't get what that means.
Yeah.
And that has been a challenge for him.
Yeah, and I'll say this, that I know maybe your next question is leading to this, but there is this whole context, right, about how do we change that dynamic, right?
Yeah.
How do we move past that in our lives and in our workplaces? And, there's multiple things that need to be happening at once, of course, right? But one way that we can get to that is equal parental leave, right? When we have that equal parental leave, for both birthing and non-birthing parents, what we are saying is that everyone's time is valuable in caring for the new child, right, that has come into a family. And when those parents come back into the workplace, right, there's no expectation that one is going to be off less time than another, right? They are both off an equal amount of time. So that there's so many positive benefits that we know to be true for families in general, right? The health and well-being of babies and children is a positive, plus the workplace change, that dynamic around bias and who is going to be leaving to birth babies versus, there's so many different dynamics, but that is a starting place that really does have a reverberation to many positive things for both work and family.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned that, because I do think it's important to talk about how we start to shift this. I want to dig into that more, but before we get there, as we're still talking about this language piece, and you and I talked a little bit before we recorded today, and there's a hesitation in my mind about what I'm about to ask you,
Okay.
that I think you appreciate, because there's, that at the time that we're recording this in May of 2024, we've just had this, I don't want to call it a cultural experience, but something happen in our culture that many people sort of paid attention to. And that is a commencement speech, and that was given by a wealthy white man who happens to play in the NFL. And he gave this commencement speech to a group of graduating college students, men and women, and used some pretty interesting language. And it sort of echoes, I think, some language that's gaining traction in some pockets of, at least pockets of the internet. It's hard to know how big those pockets are. But he talked about the idea that, or promoted the idea, I guess, that women are really supposed to be at home, serving their husbands, making babies, making sandwiches. He didn't say that, right? He didn't say, go make me a sandwich, but that's
homemade
kind of
snacks, right? Yeah.
right. But that's kind of what it was like. Congratulations, ladies on your graduation. Like, now go make your man a sandwich, was kind of the theme of this speech. I hate to even call it a commencement speech, because it was
Right.
didn't feel like a commencement speech to me. And I did listen, believe it or not, to 18 and a half of the 20-minute speech. So as we think about like the fact that language matters, and that in these pockets of the internet, we're now hearing this phrase trad wife, or, which stands for traditional wife. I don't think that Harrison Butker's comments necessarily persuaded people to one way or the other, right? He's not that powerful of a speaker. But the fact that this language is out there, I'd love to have you talk a little bit, as we're talking about the importance of language, on the impact of things like that on all of us.
Well, the clear thing here is that the language had an impact because we're still talking about it. And it is still everywhere and around. I can't believe that this language was used in these times. And then there is another side that is, he is saying what so many people are thinking. And so there is this really crazy dynamic happening in this era that we're in that I still cannot wrap my head around. I will say
Yeah.
that much. It is perplexing and really disheartening for someone like myself who's raising two daughters. They're teenage girls right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the very first thing I'd say is families get to choose, right? And women get to choose whether or not they want to go all in on family and homemaking, so to speak, right? And I even don't want to say families get to, I want to say women get to choose, right? Because if you're in a family who one person is dictating what the other should do, that's not healthy and that's not right.
Right.
In my personal opinion. So there's that piece. So the choices that families get to make are real, right? And so no shame to any woman college graduate that says, yes, that's me. I want to get married and I want to spend the rest of my time having babies. And my partner and I have made that choice and we're all in on that. That's fine. That's not the decision that I would make for my lifetime, but that is the decision that some may make. And I do not place any shame on that.
Yes.
The fact that, that in the position that he's in, he made a statement speaking on behalf of many women and basically sharing that this is how I know you feel. That is the biggest challenge that I have in all this, number one. And the second challenge that I think is happening right now, and the second piece that is bothersome, is this language we've seen accelerated over the last short while, and that there is more and more empowerment to perpetuate some pretty traditionalistic views of women's roles. And so that is the piece, the empowerment around the belief that this is where we're going, and the nature of who is using those words to perpetuate that. And so, and that is a lot of white men right now. Now back to the trad wives phenomenon, right? Which is in corners of the internet, right? That we're seeing more and more. I think that piece is a little hypocritical to me because this is women who are saying that they value servitude to their husbands and their families and have really gone back to the 1950s stay-at-home model. Again, no shame to those that make that decision if it is in fact agency of choice.
Mm-hmm.
And these women in the social circles that are perpetuating this indeed have a job. Let's be clear. They are
Right.
influencers and they're making a lot of money doing
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
So the reality of all that is false, number one. And so why this is happening now and the massive differing amounts of messages that women and girls and boys and men are receiving in this generation is perplexing. Because at the same time, I will say, my kids, my girls, and many girls in our circles of living, and this is very different depending on global geography, cultural nuance, religious nuance, etc. But I will say, in my view, women and girls are receiving a lot of empowered messaging today, right?
Yes.
You can do anything, you can be anything. They know, they understand that they understand the nuance and the challenges that have happened through history, and also their power in the world today. their perceived power in the world today as young girls, and
Yeah.
not necessarily in a space where they're believing there is an equity or equality problem.
Right.
As older, as being older and being in the space, I'm a Gen X, so being in this Gen
Yeah.
X space and going through a whole host of decades now, I can't even, I'm just 30. I can't believe it, right? I'm only
Yeah.
30. How could that have happened?
Right.
But like it is, I'm confused. I am confused. And because I don't know one woman, mother, parent, and quite frankly, in the world that I live in, I don't know one personally, one father or man that really truly believes women and mothers are second class and should be in servitude and should
Right.
not have jobs and should not paying jobs, right? So it is a very small microcosm of society. And yet we are seeing more and more these messages. And so this is a time of perplexity.
Yes.
um,
So well said. And I really appreciate how you, I think, really brought some of my own thoughts about this to life, which is that it's just confounding. The entire thing. As you know, I'm also raising two daughters, a teenager and a younger
Soon to be.
first grader right now.
Oh, well, soon to be still. It's
Still
that fast.
soon to be at some point, sooner than later, I think. You know, obviously the messaging that we are trying to pass on to them, and that is also very prominent again in the area in which we live, is that they can do whatever they darn well want to do.
Mhm.
You know, commit themselves to. And it's just confounding to hear these messages. And yet I start to wonder, because, you know, these messages they're loud, even though I think it's a small pocket. And it's coming from, you know, I see it in social media from men about sort of what they think their women should be doing, or, you know, giving antiquated, damaging dating advice. You know, as we're talking about the way that language matters, it just feels so counterproductive.
Big
Um,
time.
and even though, you know, I say, well, I don't think Harrison Butker persuaded anybody, but did his words get in, like, you know, like the cracks,
Mhm.
and do damage to the overall structure that we've been working decades to build?
Right. And I think, again, this goes to so much to why I had been teaching this course too around motherhood and work, right? Especially as a Gen Xer who was also raised in a time that was like, you can be and do anything. Truly, my parents didn't put a stop, or there were no barriers or walls to career choices, to the thought or the ability that I could do all these things. And I think where millennials and Gen X are today are, we believed that, we went for it. Oh yeah. And when we became parents, the systems and the structures didn't allow for us to be as effective and able to do both of the things that we wanted to do. In other words, be fully engaged and available to our children in motherhood, and fully engaged and available to our workplaces as well.
Yes.
And so I think that has been the fundamental problem, and where I still think there are challenges with why there are some women who still flirt with two things, right? The idea of, I want to be a mother, and I have this career I don't want to give up on. So do I
Mhm.
want to be a mother because I can't do both? Or the flip side is I really want to be a mother and I want my career, but oh my gosh, I want to be a mother so badly that I'm going to have to figure out an alternate career route, or or coast as a manager or whatnot, right? There's all these things that go on. And so this message is just saying that forget all of the contemplation that you have around career, just go all in to this one role, right? This
Mhm.
motherhood and servitude role, because that'll be easier for everyone, right? And then again, the problems with that are far and wide for many
Yeah.
reasons. Again, families and women can choose that. But I also implore everyone, I say this in my class, choice is relative, right? We make choices because the systems and the structures don't allow for other ways, right? So
Right.
if our organizations and the ways in which we worked really could be better integrated with our lives as parents and caregivers without the biases attached and without the time frames associated with school days, work days, etc., then we can start a whole new narrative on what it means to raise children and build your career.
Yeah.
And so that is really a dynamic that we really need to see. And that's where my heart is, right? My heart is into, I believe organizations have so much power to really help families and make change. And more than governments even, because just the speed at which, at least in the US, and I think that's pretty true probably in any country in the world, the speed in which governments move versus the speed in which organizations can move is vastly different. And
Yeah.
so put our energy into really changing that dynamic in the workplace, we can have positive impact in families and whole lives, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, I think, such an important thing to start thinking about and talking about. One thing I wanted to say, sort of going back to what we were talking about with this, the idea of choice. And the comments made that women should basically stay at home. Not only, and I think I said this, not only was that a white man saying that, but it was a wealthy white man saying that. And there are many, many families, and my guess is many of them are listening to this, who are thinking, I don't actually have a choice to not work.
Yes.
Right. Because, as you pointed out, there are
100%.
many dual income families. Some of that is by choice,
Mhm.
and some of that is out of necessity.
100%.
Right. And that's yet another place where the structures and the systems,
100%.
have sort of removed choice to a degree.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, we are at a place in our lives where like it's frankly nearly impossible to survive off of a single income in a family, right?
Yeah.
And there also we know that it is truly, though historically, right? And then I'll tell you there's a little piece where this has changed a little bit, but historically, right? Those women that opted out of their careers or took a pause were generally of a socioeconomic structure different and predominantly white, right?
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
there's a very different, we know that that whole narrative around women opting out of the workplace was a white woman phenomenon. And
Yeah.
women of color were never opting out of the workplace.
Yeah. They didn't have the
So
option.
no, so that whole narrative that happened with um um Sheryl Sandberg and around leaning into your career versus um just I'm having a brain moment.
That's okay.
Anne-Marie Slaughter, right? And Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was like, there's no way I can do both, right? That whole narrative of the early 2000s that were happening was
Hmm.
really a narrative that was only a relatively small percentage of the US at that time, yet it gained so much headline that it made it seem like, this was a universal, thing in the United States, and it really wasn't.
Right.
But the thing that we're seeing that's a little different now is that childcare is so darn expensive. And so, their families are weighing this option of paying for the child care and breaking even with childcare and jobs, and naming one individual, right? Like, let's say your salary is 10,000 and my salary is 20,000. Well, the person with the 20,000 salary says, then, and let's say childcare is 10,000. So
Mm-hmm.
this is how the math is working out for families, saying, how much do you want that career when
Yep.
you're not making anymore, right? And so, this is about your children that you're raising too. And again, this is a snowball effect, because when you talk about the pay gap, right, men are still earning more than women over time. And so by the time that families have children, typically it has been, and there are definite changes to this, but it has been that the male partner has been making more money. And so this idea of like, keep the higher earner going, right? But it's not that long-term view, right? Women
Yeah.
steps out even for a short period of time because of childcare. Guess what? We know what happens trying to re-enter the workforce. Bias after bias, challenge after challenge, and it just snowball effect, right? So I could go into a whole nother podcast on that, all of
Yeah.
those too. So
Which maybe we will need to do at some point, because as I listen to you talk, and I know there are people listening, and we talked about this in the class, like these are decisions that my husband and I have grappled with, right? The cost of work versus the cost of staying home. And I love my children dearly. I love being a parent. I talk parenting all day. And my husband knows that I am a happier person when I work. So almost, as he says, it's almost irrelevant. It's not really irrelevant. It's not irrelevant. But we joke that it's almost irrelevant how much money I make, because of just who I am and how I'm sort of built. But I know there are families that are grappling with those things, that it is such a hard thing to grapple with, especially when you sort of grew up thinking that you had choices that
right.
then
It
turn
is
out to
a
be
hard,
harder.
yes, absolutely. And it is, and the thing that I also have been seeing happening, and maybe that'll change with Gen Z, but what has also been happening is the thinking around what career I will pursue, even at that early age, has historically been driven by this notion of, if I have kids someday, that's going to be a lot. And I'm going to need to make sure I have a career that is forgiving to
Mhm.
family. And we haven't historically seen men ever thinking in that way of, I know I want to have kids someday, so I need to be thinking about the career that is forgiving. And I know there's exceptions to every rule, right? And in this world, Gen Z and some millennials, we know, are thinking a little bit more in these terms. But historically, it is always in the woman's mind, the careers that are being chosen, thinking about how would I lace family in there,
Yeah.
because knowing full well that, if I want to be a CEO and have children, that's could be a harder route given the organizational systems and structures that have not changed
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah. Um, I'm like, there's so many places that we could go with this. And I'm going to ask you a question, as we sort of start to come to the end of our time together, that I'm going to qualify this and acknowledge it's a pretty unfair question to ask. But from your perspective, given the work that you do and all the research that you have done into this, if we could change, like, in the snap of a finger, 3 to 5 kind of cultural things or biases, or, I know you mentioned equal parental leave for men and women is a major stepping stone to starting to shift what we're seeing. But what are a few additional things that you would love to see all of us start to think about, and maybe where we have the power to do so, try to affect change in our own families, organizations, communities, so that we start to see more equality, more options for everybody.
And this is if it was just as easy as here's your lollipop, finish it up, and we've got it covered. There are so many, it's like a web of a systemic change that we need to attack from all different directions, ultimately.
Yeah.
And then there are things that we can do. The one thing I would start with always is, every time I finish my course and I get the feedback from the students, I think the biggest thing that is a feeling that those students have of like, oh my gosh, like there has been research on this. There is names for all these things that I'm feeling. This is not a me problem.
Yeah.
Wow, this is a we problem. And that offloads a little bit. I'm not saying it gets rid of all our guilt, because we'll always harbor that, but it offloads a little of that guilt that I'm not doing a good enough job. So if we offload that to say, oh my gosh, this is a collective societal problem, we feel more powerful to like go in and talk to these things. We're not talking to this problem as, I'm having a hard time managing this. Can you help me? This is
Right.
like, let's make widespread change because I'm voicing my opinion. So I'll start there. But then if we look around, we obviously have all these different quadrants, right? We have organizational change that needs to take place. We have governmental change that needs to take place in terms of like wide sweeping policies that may never happen, but would be amazing if they did, right? And then we have like that social societal change in our communities, in our homes, in our households. And so if we think about things in those 3 buckets, we figure, what can I do, right? So if I'm a leader in an organization, there are things I can do and sort of attack things from that perspective. And there are a few different things. We have to look at the systems and structures, as I keep saying. We have to look at the people and culture and what kinds of things we can be doing there. So 100% flexible workplaces, 100% we need to start measuring and tracking who are caregivers in our workplace. And when we do that, we find that 3 out of every 4 employees is a caregiver of some aspect. And that may mean I'm caring for aging family members. Because we know this is happening, right? Boomers our aging family are living further and farther, and there's no one to care for them but family. So that's happening. We need those gender neutral family policies, the paid parental leave, childcare, all that. So those are just basic, right? Basic things that can start to be done if you're a leader in an organization. And then really that people and culture piece, leadership pathways, this whole up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like let's go up the ladder isn't realistic any longer. And so how can we look at leadership pathways that account for life stages? Everyone has life stages, whether you're a parent or you're not a parent. There's different life stages where you want to put your foot on the gas at some times and take your foot off the gas at other times. And this context of whole person leadership, I talk about this all the time. We are not just this one sliver of a human when we're at work, and we're not just this one sliver of a human when we're at home. And so acknowledging that we all have full, complex lives is incredibly valid and pertinent in today's
Yeah.
world, because we're still living like, oh, all I know is when you're my manager across from the table from me, and I know that you're sending me emails at 10 p.m., right? But we don't know
Yep.
anything else about this human. So those, and I'm kind of going off on tangents there. You said one or two, and I think I've listed like 40
No,
things.
no, I love that you mentioned all of those, because my hope in having this conversation, and, obviously in 40 minutes, we can't darn it, Kristi, we can't solve all the world's problems. But my hope is that we've planted seeds for folks who are listening to kind of think about the language, the shifts in their own, as you said, people and culture. So, we can influence the culture in our own homes.
Mhm.
I also, I always think, well, we have a lot of power as parents to help shift the thought processes, right? The biases of the next generation who might get to make some of these bigger
Yes.
changes, and not discounting ourselves in that arena. And then those who are organizational leaders may have some places to shift things in their organizations,
Right.
men and women alike, because I think this has to be a joint effort.
Yeah.
And those who, as you said, I don't know men who don't actually think women are equal, have equal value.
That are
Or
not,
are
not of equal value. That
that
are
are
equal, right.
right. In other words, the men in my life think that the women in their lives are of equal value, right? And
Yes.
have those equal roles to play.
Yes.
And we need those voices to come more to the surface and let Harrison go kick his footballs.
That's right. Right. I mean, there's right. I mean, if he had a PhD in women and motherhood and came to this research conclusion that states, right, that now that you have a degree, all you want is children and marriage, then maybe there's expertise behind that statement. But
Mhm.
if he had that PhD, that would not have been the results of the research based
Right.
on what I have been learning over the past 10 years
Yeah.
on where women's
Yeah.
minds are at and what we want out of life, a full life, right?
Yeah. Yes. A full life. We could go we could keep talking for ages. And Kristi, I'd love to have you back on the podcast at some point, because, there's so many more questions that we could dive into. And I think I'm going to have to take your class again, just because there's more to soak up with all of it and to think about as we all, are working in our own little corners and pockets of the world. But since we don't have endless time right now, Kristi, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom and being willing to dive into this recent graduation speech. Where is the best place for folks to find you who might be able to use the amazing services that you offer?
Absolutely. LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. So it's Kristi Rible. I'm on Instagram, but I'm a Gen X, so I do my best, but
Yeah.
It's not always great, but I'm always looking and I'm always there and active on that. And then I do have a website. Again, it's not the greatest, but I'm always looking at messages that are coming through. So please find me in any of those places.
Awesome. And all of those will be listed in our show notes so that people can find you. And I will give a plug. I don't know, Kristi, if you're teaching the class at Stanford again, in the continuing ed department, but for those listening pay attention, because if you are interested, it's a phenomenal course.
Yeah, I love teaching it, and I always, it's once a year, so it knock on wood, it comes again this coming year. So do keep your eyes out for that as well.
Awesome. Kristi, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much.
All right, everyone. I hope that you gained so much from that conversation. I learn something every single time I speak with Kristi, and I just know there's so much more to learn from her. As I said during the podcast, I think I may take her motherhood and work class again, just because I feel like there's so much more to soak up from her in the course of that class. She really, I think, helps us all look at and think about things from a different perspective, through a different lens, and most importantly, through the lens of choice, support, flexibility, right? All of those things that are needed for each of us as we, walk a new path, tread into new territory in the world of parenthood, working, and the combination of all those things. I encourage you to follow up on Kristi's resources, to track her down. She really has so many wonderful things to share, and I hope you enjoyed that. Until next week, have a wonderful week. Parent happy, partner happy, professional life happy, all the good things. And reach out if you need support. I'm here. Take care. Cheers.